Welcome, everyone. I'm teaching today because Gilbert's in retreat. He's with us, but he's leading a retreat in New York today, this week. So let's begin. Join palms and bow. The four great vows. I vow to master limitless approaches to Dharma. I vow to attain supreme Buddhahood. Sorry. I vow to deliver innumerable sentient beings. I vow to master limitless approaches to Dharma. The four great vows. The four great vows. I vow to deliver innumerable sentient beings. I vow to conquer endless fixations. I vow to master limitless approaches to Dharma. I vow to attain supreme Buddhahood. Thank you for joining class today. Today, I'm going to be talking about compassion. And the topic I was inspired by Ian talking about Mahakaruna, great compassion. So this is a two-part lecture. Today, we're just going to talk about compassion. And next week, we will talk about Mahakaruna, great compassion. But today, we're going to talk about kind of three levels of compassion. A really mundane compassion, the compassion of every day. And then we are going to talk about, how that becomes wise compassion and transcendent compassion. And that'll set the stage for next week's lecture on great compassion. So to begin with, I want to ask you about what is it that means compassion to you? So if you reflect on that ordinary compassion, when you have felt that you received compassion from somebody, what was it that characterized that compassion? What was it? And maybe you could say it and maybe just type it. If you can type it, I would really appreciate you putting it in the chat. When somebody was compassionate to you, what was it that characterized that compassion? Empathy, true empathy. They show concerns for my well-being, giving benefit of the doubt, understanding. So when you look at compassion, when somebody sought to understand my suffering, listening without judgment. Thank you so much. So when you look at compassion, what you find is, give me a moment. Where is this? Trying to share my screen here. There. Okay. So when you think of compassion, all of your answers, compassion starts with suffering. So there's suffering and there's a recognition of suffering. It starts there. And the simplest of definitions of compassion can be just presence with suffering, just being with suffering without turning away. If you think of what Avalokiteshvara did, he turned towards suffering. So being present with suffering. And it grows from there. So compassion, karuna, the simplest form. You could say that it's a presence with suffering. But there's a depth to it that comes from understanding. So an understanding that, hey, whatever you're going through, it's human. It's natural to feel this pain. And you alluded to that. You alluded to that when you said that somebody gave you the benefit of doubt. And there's also, if you look at compassion, there's confidence that there are many wholesome ways for you to be okay. Wholesome in that it's conducive to current and future peace of mind, that it's non-addictive, and that it doesn't lead to craving and clinging. It's non-stick. So that's the how has this suffering come to be? There's an understanding of that, and there's a confidence that there are many wholesome ways for you to be okay. And also there's underneath that there's this trust in our inherent perfect nature. So that's also part of that, somebody giving you the benefit of doubt, that they trusted in your underlying inherent perfect nature. So if we take this and we put this in our Buddha speak, if you will, compassion is dukkha. That's just a Sanskrit term for it. But then this understanding of how the suffering has come to be is coming from pratitya samutpada, dependent arising. That, this is how, one thing leads to another, causes and conditions lead to whatever suffering that you're going through right now. And then there are many ways out of this suffering. There's upaya, skillful means, that is all of the ways in which there's ways out of this suffering. And then there is this underlying Buddha nature, this inherent perfect nature that is really what makes it possible for there to be the skillful means that lead out of suffering. So this can be wise compassion in that it's not just suffering and being with suffering without turning away from suffering, but it's also this understanding that this suffering has come to be through causes and conditions, and then there are skillful means that lead out of suffering, and then there is the underlying Buddha nature, the already inherently perfect nature, regardless of the suffering. So in which the suffering is only adventitious. It's not inherent, in other words. So what makes this compassion? So far we've just talked about, just this mundane compassion and the wise compassion, which is which takes it out of just the ordinary compassion to this vaster view, if you will. And then this compassion that's wise can become immeasurable when it is recognized that all of the causes and conditions that lead to the suffering arise from ignorance, this beginningless ignorance, which is also called nascent entrenchment, which is just another way of saying beginningless or entrenched ignorance or nascience. And on the other side, that all of these many roads that lead from this suffering all lead to Buddhahood or Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi, unsurpassed, complete awakening. So this here is what can make compassion immeasurable, so that whenever suffering is encountered, it is not just, it's not just that melting of the heart. I understand the pain that's led to this suffering, and that there are many ways to that lead out of this suffering, and there is the trust in or respect for the underlying inherent Buddha nature, but also this vast view where this suffering has come from beginningless ignorance, and then this being that is suffering has an inherent Buddha nature, and that this being is on the way to unsurpassed, complete awakening or Buddhahood. So when the view is this vast, then it becomes possible for compassion to be immeasurable, so that any being that is suffering, that suffering is seen as just a transient progression between beginningless ignorance and unsurpassed, complete, perfect awakening. So the suffering itself is not entrenched, if you will. So the suffering is just there's this mistakenness that comes from the beginningless ignorance that leads to the perception of suffering, but that itself is only on the road to unsurpassed, perfect awakening. So, in going towards this immeasurable compassion, it is very useful to reflect upon what is it that makes your suffering and your compassion something that is limited. What is it that is in the donut hole of your compassion? So if you look at compassion, maybe the view that you have of compassion is vast, but when the rubber meets the road, where is it that you donut your compassion? What is in the donut hole of your compassion? So for some of us, it could be ourselves. For some of us, it could be our body. For some of us, it could be our family or certain people. Maybe compassion is easy to extend towards the whole world. Maybe compassion is easy to extend towards even criminals. But when it is somebody that is close to you, that's maybe you feel the irritation on a day in and day out way, maybe that person is not somebody that you can extend compassion to. So this is a very useful thing to consider. What is in the donut hole of your compassion? So I want to give you to give it a little bit of consideration, because while it is useful to study compassion and to see the limitlessness of it, to understand what makes compassion limitless, it's also useful to see where is it limited in your life. What is in the donut hole of your compassion? Is it yourself? Is it your body? Is it the people who are closest to you? Or is it maybe people who may not be that close to you, but who irritate you on a daily basis? Or is it, a certain segment of society? So it's very useful to see what is it that limits your compassion. Because if compassion were truly without limit, then that would be Buddhahood. So what is it that limits your compassion? Would anybody like to put something in the chat? Where is compassion limited? Certain family members. Lack of understanding. People that have hurt me deeply and aren't willing to take accountability. Self. So when we find that there are these limits, priority of self versus non-self, immediate versus less immediate, people I do not get along with, someone who would want me to get involved in a way that would not lead to the wholesome result. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. So what happens when we find a limit to compassion? So people want to maintain the status quo because it's okay for them, even while it's deeply harmful to many others. Thank you. So when you find yourself limited in your compassion, it is useful to recognize the suffering inside it. In that, when you talked about somebody who's hurt you or somebody who is not, who you do not get along well with, it is useful to say, hey, there's suffering here. There's suffering on your side, and then there's suffering from the other person's side. Because if that person weren't suffering, they would not be inflicting suffering. And if you weren't suffering, then you would be able to extend compassion. So if you look at Avalokiteshvara is somebody, Guanyin, who turned towards suffering. So when there is no compassion, the movement towards compassion is simply turning towards suffering. And that suffering may be yours, that suffering may be somebody else's. So the barest, the most simple and the most mundane definition of compassion is simply to listen to suffering, to be present with suffering. So and when you find that your well of compassion is dry, it means that there is some suffering that you're not seeing. If you were to see suffering, then compassion will spring by itself. So that is simply the nature of compassion, that compassion arises when suffering is truly seen. What is compassion? Allowing somebody to go through the lesson. I recognize that I have a lack of wisdom to turn my limited compassion into something wholesome when I get involved with this person. So so I'm also hearing that that there are times when you feel that extending compassion may not be wise. So what is some of the feedback here is that there are times when you feel that extending compassion is not wise. So would somebody want to come on and talk about talk about where you feel like, oh, if I extend compassion, it may not be the wise thing to do. Suzanne.
The most simple that I can think of is when a toddler is learning to walk and they fall down and they cry. One must allow them to get themselves back up and to comfort themselves so they have this experience, because it is a necessary thing to learn. And if we interfere and protect them from this lesson, we are interfering with the true nature of being.
So sometimes compassion is the so let me rephrase this. Sometimes, compassion is staying with suffering without reaching for a premature end to suffering. So in other words, there's a danger in not being able to stay with suffering, so that you want to quickly resolve it so that there's no more suffering. But in doing that, you are not, you're doing it more from an inability to stay with suffering rather than a skillful means towards actually and truly ending the suffering. Would that be? Yes. Yes. So which kind of boils down to the ability to stay with suffering, the ability to look for skillful means that are wholesome. And that would that is in fact what true compassion is, as compared to unwise compassion, which truly is not compassion. It truly is an inability to stay with suffering, the ability to eat bitter. Yes, the ability to eat bitter, or you could even say the inability to wait for fruit to ripen. So there's fruit that's ripening, but then there is this inability to wait for it to truly ripen. So now I want so we've talked about what is just mundane compassion and what is wise compassion, and what is it that makes compassion limitless. And so now I want to talk about transcendent compassion. So let's bring up. This is the Perfection of Wisdom in 8,000 lines that talks about transcendent compassion. So I'm going to read this verse. But when the notion of suffering and beings leads him to think, suffering I shall remove, the wheel of the world I shall work. Beings are then imagined, a self is imagined. The practice of wisdom, the highest perfection, is lacking. So what's going on here is that, when we make a thing out of suffering, when we make a thing out of, the well-being of the suffering beings, and then when we make a thing out of the suffering beings themselves, right? Then what happens is that we solidify in such a way that the practice of wisdom at the highest perfection is lacking. So, in other words, for compassion to be transcendent, we cannot thingify suffering. We cannot thingify the well-being of the person who's suffering. We cannot thingify the person who is suffering. So nor can we thinkify ourselves, because as part of doing all of this, we are solidifying. So remember in the slide when I showed you that on the way from beginningless ignorance towards unsurpassed awakening, there is suffering. So the suffering that that's there is just transient. And underlying that is the inherent perfect Buddha nature. So if instead of seeing this as simply the flow of causes and conditions, instead of seeing it that way, if suffering is solidified, if the person who is being compassionate is imagined to be imagined to be solid, imagined to be somebody who accrues merit, that is doing excellent service towards the well-being of the world, then what happens there is not truly compassion. It's not transcendent compassion. So this is now beyond mundane compassion, beyond even wise compassion, in that the suffering, it's not just about recognizing suffering. It's not just about seeing that suffering results, whatever causes and conditions may have resulted in the suffering, that underneath the suffering is inherent perfect Buddha nature, that suffering is something that's transient, that that is experienced on the way towards awakening. Instead of seeing this as simply a flow, it has been glommed onto. That suffering has become solidified as a thing, and then there's an imagining of ourselves as somebody who is a bodhisattva, helping others, and the people who are suffering, the beings are also a thing. So all of this solidification, that's when that solidification happens, the practice of wisdom, the highest perfection, is lacking. So prajna paramita is not there. So that's not transcendent wisdom. So there is no transcendent wisdom if any of these things are happening. If compassion is solidified, if the suffering being is solidified, if the helping being, the bodhisattva, is solidified. And the next verse says, he wisely knows that all that lives is unproduced as he himself is. He knows that all that is no more exists than he or any beings. The unproduced and the produced are not distinguished. That is a practice of wisdom, the highest perfection. So here, the bodhisattva wisely knows that all that lives is unproduced as he himself is. So this is to say that all beings are not solid, are beginningless, right? He knows that all that is no more exists than he or any beings. The unproduced and the produced are not distinguished. That is a practice of wisdom, the highest perfection. So all that is left is emptiness. But here, what is really, really key is from this space of emptiness, there is compassion. So this compassion is truly transcendent because it is not stuck to an imagined being that is suffering, an imagined suffering, an imagined helping being, a being that is helping someone. So in order for compassion to be truly immeasurable, truly limitless, it has to be transcendent. And that transcendent compassion is arising from transcendent wisdom or prajna paramita, where there is no concept of a suffering being, a helping being, or of suffering itself. So, but on the way to this transcendent wisdom, it's one analogy from Gilbert is very helpful to kind of not get stuck to the emptiness of emptiness itself. In that, in one of Gilbert's public lectures, somebody who was like, well, if all of this is really empty, then why should you even practice, or why should you even care? And then he said, hey, this was a college, in a college town. And then he said, if you have a roommate and your roommate is, dreaming, it's a nightmare, and they're just thrashing about, would you wake your roommate, or would you say, hey, it's not, they're just dreaming, it's okay, and you just leave them be? And the person who asked the question said, of course I'll wake my roommate up. Why would you do that? Because that person who's dreaming is thinking that they are suffering, and that's why you'd wake up somebody who's going through a nightmare. So it's the same kind of thing. Even though the suffering is unproduced, even though the suffering being is unproduced, even though the helping being is unproduced, still there is work to be done. Still there is upaya, or skillful means, that need to be employed in waking that suffering being, so that the suffering being can also experience that suffering is unproduced, that that there is no suffering being, and no helping being. So until every suffering being recognizes that there is no suffering, there is still skillful means to be employed. But the bodhisattva who practices transcendent wisdom, prajna paramita, the compassion, the transcendent compassion, comes from a recognition of no suffering. So if mundane compassion and wise compassion comes from a recognition of suffering, then transcendent compassion comes from from transcendent wisdom, prajna paramita, of no suffering. But skillful means is still employed, because until every suffering being also recognizes no suffering, there is still work to be done. So, so that kind of sets the stage for more exploration on Maha Karuna, that is to come next week. And Gilbert wants me to read the line, non-produced and produced is not distinguished. Let me just go back. Okay. So he wisely knows that all that lives is unproduced as he himself is. He knows that all that is no more exists, all that is no more exists than he or any beings. The unproduced and the produced are not distinguished. Gilbert, did you want to talk about something there? Oh, you're on mute.
Hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. This part goes to the very essence of the practice and the very essence of mind. So when we talk about the unproduced and the produced are not distinguished, what's important about that is that it's not that it's non-existent. So the dream is not non-existent. It is existent within mind. So we cannot, if it was non-existent, then it would not be part of mind. But it's not distinguished in mind to be non-existent. That's what we're talking about, the existent or the extinguishment of existence or non-existence. It is part of the Dharma body, the Dharmakaya. And so when we use this wisdom, this unbridled compassion, it's the unbridled compassion as one would see a Dharma body, the Buddha body. And I was saying today, if there was a splinter in the foot of the Dharma body, the hands would help remove the splinter from the foot. If there is this dream that's in there, of course, there will be sent an appearance body of a Buddha to teach how to come out of the dream. And so it's a very interesting one because that's this compassion that is used universally, and it's unbridled because it uses the full power of the heart mind of the Buddha to do this. The Buddha not being an entity, but simply mind. Buddha is mind, mind is Buddha. Mm-hmm. And so when we see it in this way, it is then we begin to realize the power of this unbridled compassion, which is incredible if one is able to harness it in the right way, then it will work. So what you're saying actually is what today I was presenting, and I was referring to Dao Xin, the fourth patriarch, and him referring to the Avatamsaka Sutra. And he said, if you have the view that beings in samsara and I am able to save them, and these beings are capable of being saved, then you're not to be called a bodhisattva. Saving beings is similar to saving empty sky, which is what you're saying. So you and I are right on the same page with this. And it says, how can the sky ever have come or gone? Mm-hmm. So it is in this way that we do this. I just wanted to be clear about that. There's not an extinguishment of the idea of a life and being. There's no distinction between that and mind. It belongs to mind. So it transcends the idea of existence and non-existence. But yeah, what you're saying is very good.
Thank you so much, Gilbert. How beautiful, how beautiful. So I want to additionally say that this transcendent wisdom, the prajna paramita, is what is making transcendent compassion possible, which is what you were saying too. But that's so there is no transcendent compassion without transcendent wisdom. So there's a couple of things to be wary of. One is the emptiness of emptiness. So there is a very fine line between saying that there's no suffering at all to denying suffering. So you don't want to end up denying suffering, because suffering is empty. So to go to know suffering, you have to know suffering. So if you're turning away from suffering because you're dismissing it as, hey, there is no suffering at all, right? Then that's not transcendent wisdom. That's not transcendent compassion. So one of the things that as practitioners we have to be wary about is, are we kidding ourselves? Are we claiming to be further along the path than we actually are? No path, but still, if you think that you have attained no path, that's a terrible place to be. Better to be on the path than to think that you have attained no path, that you have attained, no attainment, that you have seen through suffering. So it's just it's something to be very. It's like walking on the knife's edge. It's the hair that the width of the hair that separates awakening from beginningless ignorance. So a word of caution along while practicing that. Are you turning away from suffering, or are you seeing through suffering? To see through suffering, which is transcendent compassion, transcendent wisdom, there's no turning away. There's no turning away when you're seeing through suffering. So transcendent compassion is seeing through suffering. Is seeing through to prajna paramita, the transcendent wisdom that is seeing through suffering to what is seen through is also transcendent wisdom, which is another way of saying it is mind that sees through suffering, and what is seen is also mind. That's just another way of saying that. So that is not going to happen if suffering is dismissed as there is no suffering. So just be really wary of that. In practice, that's super important. It's super important not to kid ourselves, to claim that we are on the path of no path. To claim that there's no attainment, and it's an attainment that that you're on the path of no path, and that you know that there is no attainment. Just there's just subtle layers of the self that come through that just needs to be seen through. That needs to be seen through, so that you don't get stuck on yet another flavor of beginningless ignorance. So any comments, questions?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can. Oh, okay, good. We were definitely on the same path today. The idea of emptiness, we could say, is an idea that we should not think that it's empty like an empty vessel, but it's all inclusive, and there's an intimacy that's there. I would say that the prajna paramita is what we use to this Prajnaparamita wisdom is what we use to serve as a platform. And the Anyatara Samyak Sambodhi, this highest wisdom, is the gateway to mind. Once the gateway is realized, then one realizes there is no wisdom there. But one has to pass through for that realization from the mind side, not from the practitioner side. So you're correct with that you still have to practice. And someone as I was saying in my retreat today, they said, well, when I was saying these things, they're saying, well, why then why am I learning from you? And I said, you learn from me until you realize I have nothing to teach you. And so it's this way that we understand that transcendence. Then there's not a notion of wisdom. They're not even Anyatara Samyak Sambodhi. But you, until such time, then you utilize this wisdom up through the highest perfected wisdom. So that's good. What you're saying, I agree with you.
Thank you, Gilbert. Anybody with questions?
And so I think Tori is raising her hand.
Oh, I can't see you, Tori. Give me a moment. Yeah. Go ahead. You can unmute yourself. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Sentha, for the very wonderful lecture. Sorry, the format has changed for the screen for the Zoom, so I couldn't find the raising hand.
Oh, no worries. Yeah.
So it's not a question. It's just something that, I feel like I struggle every single day because of my job as a psychotherapist for veterans. And it's that, I guess ultimately it's the lack of that ultimate wisdom, even though it's like I can intellectually understand that the empty sky, that, there's no sentient beings. Yes, they are suffering, and therefore that requires the skillful means, right? And it's the lack of skillful means and lack of that ultimate wisdom, because when we attain the ultimate wisdom, we would get the skillful means one way or the other, is to be able to help them. And there are people that would want to get involved in a way that is just not wholesome, right? So that's when I need to set that boundaries, and I can hold that compassionate space. And I like the other student, she was saying the baby felt that they have to stand up on their own, and it's kind of, my job as a therapist to guide them to stand up. But then there are people that, well, if you don't do it my way, then I'm walking away. That, like, the baby just gets away from you now. They don't want to get involved with you because they don't want you to help them in a way that is wholesome and healthy. And they perceive in a different way that, the way that's not, that it's kind of like that enabling, that codependency to be what they wanted it. So that's my
Can you hold on just a bit? I want to unpack some of the things that you said, because I'm not writing down any notes or anything like that. There's several things that you said. So one of the first things that you said was that if only if only there was unsurpassed, unequaled awakening, then there would be skillful means or upaya. So that, so that's something that needs to be like opened up a little bit, because there's already Buddha nature. There's already enough awakening that skillful means are available. At no point are skillful means unavailable. So this requires a certain amount of trust in your own Buddha nature to be able to see the skillful means that are already present. And also in the other person, that perhaps right now only their beginningless ignorance is visible. But underneath all of that beginningless ignorance, this also is a being that is progressing towards Buddhahood. So, so to see through that situation, to open up and to have that faith, then the skillful means will become apparent. This is not the case.
Thank you.
Yeah. And when this person in front of you, there you are as a bodhisattva, as a helping being, wanting to work towards alleviating the suffering of the being in front of you. And you hand out a skillful mean, an upaya, and that person is not willing to take that up, right? They're not willing to take that up. They want their candy. They want that unwholesome, um, that unskillful means that'll probably, that as a therapist, that is going to lead to more clinging, craving, clinging, and more suffering. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, compassion is first off to know suffering, to recognize suffering, and to not turn away from suffering, and to not give, to not to resort to, oh, let's close the door on this suffering and just get out, right? So there's a the boundary may be in saying that you're reaching for candy, and that candy is going to cause tooth decay. That as a therapist, but but that person, the candy they are reaching for is maybe better than something worse, right? So there's this whole gradation of upaya, and what is it that is most accessible. So in the Lotus Sutra, there is this story of a very rich merchant. The house, he's got children, and the kids are playing and having fun, but the house is on fire. So then the merchant says, oh, there's this wonderful, cart with like fancy toys outside. Let's go get it. And the kids run out, but there's no fancy toy, but they got saved from the fire. So that's like really skillful means, because it's like the kids wouldn't go if because they don't understand the problem. However, they're going to be attracted to something that sounds good to them. So the merchant here is employing skillful means in leading the kids towards something that they think they can look forward to. But what the merchant is actually doing is leading them away from what he knows is bad for them, right? So but he recognizes that if he just said, oh, this is bad for you, this is bad for you, then the kids aren't going to move. So the skillful means is in seeing, is in recognizing the suffering and in understanding how the suffering has come to be, and in knowing that there are ways out of this suffering. And then this is the hardest thing, in making that person who's suffering want to go out from that suffering and towards that, awakening, but just that first little step, how to kind of entice them to take that first little step. And that enticing has to happen by appealing to what that person values. It cannot be like, let me give you a great big lecture on on how your suffering has come to be, and how, if you don't get out of suffering, sometimes that's appropriate, but to motivate this person to move away from suffering, you have to kind of inspire them, to motivate them with something that they already value. Here in the Lotus Sutra, it's a toys. I mean, the kids, they love toys. So how to use their love of toys to lead them from, guaranteed suffering. So that skillful means, and that skillful means is available to you now if you can only recognize, what is the toy here? For this person in front of you, what is a toy? Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much. I mean, this is a very difficult dilemma. So I
Yes,
really
yeah.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're
Thank you.
welcome. Thank you. Anybody else? Thank you, Gilbert.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Jake.
Yep. So you mentioned this line about not trying to think about a suffering being as a concept, because I think then compassion becomes sort of conditional. And I wonder, like, how to think then about the first of the four great vows that we recite, like,
Yeah.
like that. Or I'm not saying that there's a
Yeah.
contradiction, but like that just sort of stuck out to me as like
Yeah. I was like, I was stumbling over the four great vows, and I was like, it was not a an accident. At sometimes it's like I cannot pull the four great vows out. It's just like, it's very dualistic, the four great vows, but it's not as though we are not dualistic. Who are we kidding? Is there like every minute of every day? Where is a minute anyway, if there's no duality? So we do there's plenty of time for us to be in fully dualistic mode. So that's when the four great vows kick in.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's elements of compassion that I haven't touched on that I want to touch on next week, which is like, compassion is just this wonderful fuel. It's just wonderful fuel on the path. There's nothing like it. It's like your ultimate clean burning fuel. So we'll talk about that next week. But yeah, so any other questions? Rongchen.
No, Santha, it's a wonderful talk. My reflection is that one cannot go jump ahead of his actual step. I mean, you have to crawl and walk, and then before you can start to run and jump.
Yes.
Because for transcendent compassion is a very far-reaching goal.
Yeah.
We have to start very small and be very sincere. And we have to let go very quickly.
Yeah.
I think often we are dualistic.
Yes.
If we are not dualistic, we are already beyond our current level. So
beyond what? I'm sorry.
Beyond our actual level. I think as a step by step, but I think it will come slowly. Many. That's my reflection.
Yeah, and these things happen. It's like you have to simultaneously practice mundane compassion, this everyday compassion, and you have to be, honest about where the limits are to your compassion. Because there are limits until Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi, until we reach unsurpassed Buddhahood, there are limits. Where are your limits? What is in the donut hole of your compassion? You have to be aware of this. And that is what, that's what makes us practitioners. But I'm not saying this as like a kind of a glib, easy, way out that, of course, we're all practitioners. No, it's very, very, very important. It's very important to know where the limits are of your compassion. It's very important when to know when you're turning away from compassion, even if it is by just saying that, oh, there's no suffering. There's no cause of suffering. Are you turning away from suffering by saying that, or are you seeing through suffering? These are two very, very different things. And before you can see through suffering, you have to know suffering. I'm going to share this screen here. There it is. Okay. There's a difference between saying that there's no suffering versus knowing suffering, and because of knowing suffering, to go to know suffering. It's a huge difference. The first is just denial, and the second is transcendence. It's super, super, super important to know the difference. To be on the lookout for when you may go into denial. So it's better to be wallowing in suffering than to simply go into denial. Because at least then you know that you're suffering. Right? So at first you know that you're suffering, and then you recognize and suffering, meaning that you understand that suffering has come to be through causes and conditions. This is acceptance. This is that first of Bodhidharma's 4 practices. I don't want to go into that right now, but knowing suffering, knowing causes and conditions, and then skillful means, and then having that trust in our inherent perfect nature, which is Buddha nature. All of those things are immediately available, even like as a mundane, mundane suffering. You can say, hey, it's natural that I'm suffering. It's human that I'm suffering. This happens. It's causes and conditions. And then out of every moment of suffering, there's skillful means. If I can open up to skillful means. And then underlying all of this is my inherent perfect Buddha nature. So if you can recognize all of this, then compassion is flowing. So it's important to know suffering before going into there is no suffering or cause of suffering. Step 1, no suffering. KNOW. Yeah. So Suzanne says, one cannot appreciate the sun if one has not experienced the rain. All right. Anybody else wants to say anything? Okay, we'll call it a night. Join palms. Bow. Thank you for joining class today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra.